We have seen a lot of projects using ESP8266 and PIR sensor, where there is a movement detected using the PIR and it turns on the light. So the first thing that ESP8266 does is it connects to an MQTT server and sends an MQTT message that it has seen some kind of motion. And Home Assistant instance can actually subscribe to a topic on MQTT that this guy is posting to, and that is listed as a sensor. So you can just define an MQTT sensor, and you can define a Home Assistant automation that says that once you see a motion, you turn on the light. Okay, so there are multiple steps involved. That involves MQTT server that needs to be running, and the Home Assistant needs to communicate to MQTT, the automation needs to be set up, the sensor needs to be set up, and the light needs to be set up on Home Assistant. So to make this process simpler, what I have developed is HARestAPI, so Home Assistant REST API. So in this case, what ESP8266 does is sends a REST request to Home Assistant. So we will look at the REST interface of Home Assistant here. So this is the RESTful API that you can use for Home Assistant. IFTTT uses this to interface with your Home Assistant. So all this does is it sends a GET, or you can send post commands. So basically you can post different states, you can get different states, and you can actually use various functions on Home Assistant, turning on lights, turning off lights, using the post and get functions of the RESTful API. So now that we know how the REST sensor is called on Home Assistant, we can then turn on the light directly on the Home Assistant without going to the MQTT. So this is where you download the Home Assistant REST API library for Arduino. Here is a link. I'll post the links below. Just go download this zip, and in your Arduino, sketch, include library, add zip file, and point that to that particular library. So I've included an example functions. Once you install this particular library, go to examples and go to HARestAPI, and this is that example. So you probably need bounds as well, but anyway, so this is the example that you can use to try out this particular library. So to use this HARest API library, all you have to do is first include this library at the top of your INL sketch in Arduino. If you are using SSL, then use these two lines. So define a Wi-Fi client secure and pass that to the API. And if you're not using SSL, you can just define Wi-Fi client and pass that to the HARest API. And define the IP address of your Home Assistant, define the port, and if you have a password, define the password. Then use these values inside the setup. So here you define the IP port and say set HA server and set HA password. And then if you have a SSL, you can double check if this is the correct fingerprint. Go and check what your fingerprint is for your SSL server, and you can use this HA.set fingerprint, and what this does is it checks if this particular fingerprint is of your server, and then it sends whatever requests. You can't spoof this particular signature. So there are three ways that you can use HARest API. So the first way is to actually just turn on a light. So we first define a URL, API services light turn on or turn off. I'll show you where to find this on Home Assistant. So in your Home Assistant instance, click on this left panel and click on developer tools and services. So this is the different URLs that you can create. So in this case you can use light.turn on, and you can pick whichever light you want. So this particular light. So this is your component, and this is your services, API /services/light/turn on. Okay, so this is what defines your URL, and this is what defines the entity. Okay, so this entity is what is your component. Okay, now that we know what URL is and what component is, so you put your component right here, and then you just send that to HA, and that turns on the light. If you want to turn on a switch, all you have to do is change the URL, API services switch, turn on, and you turn on whatever switch that you have defined by using these three lines. And I have also written something to turn on light that has RGB function. So all you have to do is first set this component. So let's say it's light.rgb light, and then ha.send ha.rgb light, and send your red, green, and blue value, and that turns on the light with those specific colors. So you can use any combination of red, green, and blue. Okay, so I'll be looking forward to different projects using this particular API in the Arduino library. I hope this is useful. So see you. Bye.